Good evening. We are live across the UK. We're live across the world for this evening's Solomon Live. My name is Brodie. I have the honour and the privilege of hosting these monthly webinars of lively Freemasonry conversation. And if you have any questions to put to our distinguished guests this evening, please add them to the chat screen at the bottom of your computer. And this evening, we're talking to a Freemason. Well, I'll rephrase that. We're talking to a non-Freemason, and we're delighted to say that we're joined by John Dickie, author of The Craft, How the Freemasons Made the Modern World. John, it's really good to see you. How are you?
Very nice to be here. I'm very good, very good.
Well, it's great to have you here, and a lot of people have been very excited about your presence here today. How does that feel? Because we've got lots of people joining us from all over the UK, indeed all over the world at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really nice. I've been delighted with the reception that the book's got. I mean, one of the intentions I went into writing the book with was to kind of create a dialogue between Masons and non-Masons, to be able to talk to both communities, because, you know, even my pitch to the publishers, I said, look, there are two audiences here, and they don't really talk to each other. Masons write books for Masons by and large, and non-Masons write for non-Masons about the terrible things the Masons do, and somewhere you know, they've got to meet in the middle. You can try and cater for both. And that seems to be happening. So that's very exciting.
I think you've achieved that. You're absolutely right. I've heard feedback from Masons and non-Masons alike, and you've certainly achieved that. Absolutely. So let's begin. Why did you write this book in the first place? What interested you to put this book together?
Well, what excites me are projects where there's a widespread interest in the subject, and even widespread convictions that people know what they already know about a certain subject, know what they think, you know, they're pretty confident in their opinions, but where there are a lot of surprises to be had. And I think in this subject, yes, it was sort of adjacent to my previous interests. I'm a professor of Italian studies. I know quite a lot knew quite a lot already about the history of Freemasonry in Italy. So I knew enough about it, and it was adjacent to some of my previous interests. I was having written about the mafia. I thought I could bring some of those readers with me into talking about Freemasonry. Certainly in Italy, where the two are considered almost synonymous, but that's a different story. Yeah, I mean, that's basically the appeal. And apart from anything, there were just, as I read into the subject, I realized there were so many extraordinary stories there that just needed to be told properly, researched properly, and told properly.
Now, you're not a Freemason yourself, and you have no desire to become a Freemason, but do you have any Freemasonry in the family?
Yeah, my grandfather was a Freemason. I mean, he died when I was very small, but he was he was a professional soldier, fought all the way through the First World War. And he was one of millions from the combatant countries who joined the craft in the immediate aftermath of the war for reasons of camaraderie and finding his place back in society after serving in the military. Yeah, there is that element in the family, and like so many people do. I mean, I'm not remotely exceptional in that.
Now, it's taken you 5 years to put the book together, and clearly you had a view on Freemasonry before that. So, John, if I could ask you the question, what is Freemasonry?
Okay. I would say that it is a system of collective self-improvement through brotherhood, through ritual, through symbols, and so on and so forth, bound together by some very ingenious practices and traditions, including secrecy.
So let's talk about why you think Freemasonry exists. Who does it fulfill? People, society? Where did it come from?
Well, I mean, one of the great secrets of Freemasonry and one of the great challenges of writing its history is that it has meant very, very different things in different times and places. The basic ingredients of Freemasonry that have made it so contagious, if you like, as a way of organizing that meant that it spread so quickly around the world in the early 18th century and has continued and so on, millions of members, are really the idea of an oathed brotherhood, again, based on secrecy, ritual, symbol, and so on. An organization that is both has local cells, if you like, the lodges, and yet also a broader network. That is actually an extraordinarily ingenious structure, so ingenious, in fact, that it has then been borrowed, elements of it have been borrowed, plagiarized, if you like, by all kinds of people, from the Sicilian mafia to the Mormon church to the many, many other fraternal organizations that are the offspring of Freemasonry, if you like, particularly in the United States. But, you know, as you can guess, you know, those are things that have very different purposes and very different ethos underlying each one of them. So, you know, and I very much wanted to represent that in the book and not just write a history that was just Orthodox Freemasonry. Because I remember that when I first met the late lamented head of communications at the Grand Lodge, Mike Baker, he told me, look, John, we have a problem of brand control in the Freemasons. He used to be in advertising or marketing or something. And that meant that people rip off the Freemasons. You know, one of the great things about Freemasonry, people can see in it individually what they want, shape their Freemason around their own way, but it also means that it can be copied, and there are all these long-standing disputes over jurisdiction and the authenticity of rituals and so on and so forth. And you have to take that into account. You can't decide before you start writing, okay, that is Freemasonry, that one thing, and everything else is just is not worth writing about. It's all part of the same phenomenon.
And there's been a lot of debate over this over the years, John. You'll know this only too well. When did Freemasonry actually begin?
Okay, there are two key moments, I think, two well-documented key moments. The first, at the court of King James VI of Scotland at the very end of the 16th century. And that's when you get this marriage between the Renaissance culture and the Renaissance philosophy, particularly philosophy called Hermeticism, of King James's court. This is the King James who would become James I of England, who was a scholar king, if you like, fancied himself as a bit of a Solomon. And between that Renaissance culture and the culture of the stonemasons, who were looking effectively for royal patrons and royal patronage, because one of the things about about stonemasons is they've always been rubbish at making guilds. The story that the Freemasons grew out of guilds omits one crucial fact, is that stonemasons were uniquely awful compared to, you know, goldsmiths or cobblers or whoever it might be, or saddlers, at forming guilds. And so they were the least likely, if you like, to endure as a form of brotherhood. So that was the foremost. It was the sponsorship of the court and that magical mixture with Renaissance philosophy. That's when you start to get gentlemen, you know, non-stonemasons joining and so on. And the second moment is that moment around 1717 to 1723 in London, when you get the formation of the Grand Lodge, when you get the writing of Anderson's constitutions. And those are the things that really trigger you know, the extremely rapid spread of Freemasonry around the globe.
Now let's talk about secrecy, because we can't talk about Freemasonry without secrecy. So when we go all the way back, to John Custos, 1743, in Lisbon and the Holy Office of the Inquisition. You start your book with that, in fact, don't you? Does it surprise you that we're still talking about secrecy in 2021?
It doesn't surprise me remotely, in fact, because that's the purpose of secrecy. That is the purpose of Masonic secrecy. It is not to keep secrets, because the content of those secrets, forgive me, is pretty banal. It's motherhood and apple pie. When you strip all the ritual and symbol away, it's home truths. The point is that the secrecy creates a sense of mystique, which is non-religiously specific. And that's very, very important, particularly at the time when Freemasonry was formed. You had to create a sense of an aura around the organization that was quasi-religious, but had no specific theological content. Because in those days, you know, you could be hung, drawn, and quartered for, you know, saying the wrong thing religiously speaking. But at the same time, of course, and I think it's disingenuous of Freemasons to pretend otherwise, secrecy is there to create a sense of mystique vis-a-vis the outside world, to bind people into the fold as holders of the secrets, and at the same time to create a sense of fascination and hostility on the part of the outside world, to create misunderstanding. Because any scholar of community, how communities are formed, whether they be national communities or whatever, will tell you that they're formed by drawing boundaries between who's in and who's out, and making policing those boundaries with symbols, with rituals, with all kinds of things. And that's what secrecy does. So that's exactly what's still happening. It happened, the Daniel Morgan, thing, that, a fantastic report into police corruption in the axe murder of Daniel Morgan in the 1980s. And a lot of suspicion about that centered on Freemasonry, as it often did at the time in the 80s and 90s. And this report concludes there is no evidence of any wrongdoing by Freemasons. But it also concludes, well, we can understand, however, that there is a lot of suspicion and mistrust generated by Freemasonry, because Freemasons take these oaths of secrecy and so on and so forth. Now, clearly they didn't take the, talk to the right people before they drew that up, but you can't expect anything else, because secrecy in the time since the court of King James VI in Scotland, in the time since the foundation of the Grand Lodge in 1717, transparency has become one of the key values of our public life. We as a democratic country, democratic countries across the world expect to know what's going on in the institutions that they vote for, in the institutions that they entrust power to. And secrecy is anathema to that. And so, trouble is bound to happen. Misunderstanding is bound to happen. And that's a problem that's not going to go away for Freemasonry, however much explaining, however much they do an open door policy at the, Freemasons Hall, how many books some people like me write.
You think there's some way to go before we manage to convince the world there's nothing going on? And for you being a non-Mason, did it actually help you or hinder you when it came to putting this book together?
What's that? The being a non-Mason?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think that whether I'm a Mason or not, I would have written the same book. I mean, what helped me most of all is having the training of a professional historian and having a lot of experience as a writer who, historical writer who writes for presenting complicated profoundly sourced and documented arguments in a form that people can read on the tube or on the train, you know, and that make the pages turn. That's what I do. So I like to think that it was that I would have written the same book. I think being a non-Mason certainly helped me not make any assumptions about what people know. If you like, start from the point of view of people's ignorance about Freemasonry, in explaining the basics, in catering for people's suspicions and misunderstandings, and going to meet them and explaining, well, you know, there is a reason for that, but it's not quite the way you think. So in that sense, it did, explaining rather than interpreting.
Now, obviously, your book looks at Freemasonry and, of course, all over the world as well. And we've got a lot of history in Freemasonry. Why do you think it stood the test of time when other fraternal organizations have perhaps fallen by the wayside, or maybe just not as successful?
I think it's more or less as I explained at the beginning. It's you know, we rather scoff at rituals these days, you know, or we somehow assume we're immune to rituals, and that's just one ingredient, obviously, of Freemasonry, an important one all the same. But we like to think we're sort of past that, and we look at the religion, you know, the rituals of other belief systems, other religions, whether they be the Freemasons or some religion we're not familiar with. I mean, I grew up as a kind of semi-Scottish Anglican, you know, whatever. Other people's religions smell a bit funny. They look a bit weird, their rituals. And of course, that makes us forget just how profoundly part of our everyday lives they are. You know, shaking hands, graduation ceremonies, christenings, you know, cheers when we have a drink, you name it. Our lives, even the morning coffee has a ritual aspect to it. And we forget that rituals are a very, very powerful way of marking stages in our lives, of bringing people together. And we're never going to be able to do without those components. And I think one of Freemasonry's great secrets is, of course, the power of its rituals and the centrality it gives to rituals in its collective life.
Now we'll go to some of the questions on the screen now, John, if that's okay with you. We've got lots to get through, and brethren and ladies and gentlemen, we know we're not going to be able to discuss absolutely every aspect of Freemasonry, but we'll give it a good shot between now and closing time. So this is from Mike Bushby. He says, when writing your book, did you also look into other orders, side orders that are within Freemasonry?
Yes, I did. I mean, obviously, I couldn't cover everything. I mean, that way madness lies, you know, if I tried to cover everything all over the world. The one I chose was to follow through history was the Scottish Rite, or the Rose Choir, as it's known in Britain. Really, I mean, it seemed emblematic to me because it's one of the richest and most complicated systems. It's also very international. You know, you follow the Scottish Rite and you go from France to Italy to the Caribbean to the United States. You go all over the world. And it really is a remarkable tale. And it's a kind of parable. It's just one representative side degree. It's a kind of parable of that sort of international contagious dimension of Freemasonry. So that's why I picked the Scottish Rite.
Thank you very much indeed, Mike, and we'll get back to some more questions in a few minutes. So let's talk about ceremonies, because you do talk about ceremonies in your book, and I know you've got a bit of flack from making some supporters talking about the degrees. Why do we have those ceremonies within Freemasonry? What do they symbolize?
Well, I mean, they're obviously some of those symbols are codified. And then there's within Freemasonry, there's a sort of small industry of people generating ever more meanings of them. It's a little bit, a little bit like the symbolic dimensions of the Bible in that respect, in that people, one of their great secrets, or great works of literature, one of the great secrets of their success is they're always open to interpretation and seeing more in there, and so on and so forth. So they bring people together, as I said, but they also allow a margin for individual interpretation, and so on. And of course, they generate disputes over what's the correct form and what's the history, and is this legitimate or is it not? And that internal politics and diplomacy of Freemasonry and the arguments that go on over that are an integral part of what Freemasonry is. I mean, I think some Freemasons get quite a lot of pleasure out of engaging in all that stuff. So yeah, that's the short answer.
So let's talk about the role of religion within Freemasonry. Now, we know we're a secular organisation, but what role has religion played in Freemasonry, and how has it changed over the years in Freemasonry?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends where you go. I'm an atheist. I couldn't become a Freemason for that reason in this country, but I could in France since whenever it was, 1876 or something like that, that the Grand Orient allowed atheists to join. Staying within the sort of canons of English Freemasonry, British Freemasonry more generally, and other similar orders, I take issue. I mean, I think it's not as simple as saying that Freemasonry isn't a religion because we're not allowed to talk about religion in meetings. I think any organization, any belief system that deals with big ethical issues, how to behave right and wrong, deals with the business of trying to make people better, and as it were, regulate and improve their behavior, that deals with some of the big metaphysical issues, may not be a religion in the sort of codified sense. I call it a kind of second order religion, because it does, including binding people together. The word religion comes from the Latin word for to bind people together in fellowship, if you like. Freemasonry, so I call it a second order religion, if you like. It sort of, if it quacks and it walks like a duck, it's sort of getting close to being a duck, if you like. Just to give you an example, death is clearly a theme that is absolutely central to Masonic ritual. It's absolutely all over the place, most obviously in the third degree, Master Mason's degree, and revolves around a scenario of resuscitating or resurrecting someone from the death. Now, death is the big question. That's the one that religions have to deal with. What are we doing here and why do we die? Bertrand Russell, the great philosopher, said, look, all religions, that's why they're there, to address the fear of death. And Freemasonry does that. And that, in my book, makes it, gives it a lot of strong overlaps with a religion, even though it's not in the kind of party political or church sense. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does completely. So who doesn't like Freemasonry, John? Who isn't a fan of Freemasonry?
Right. Well, a good part of the book is dedicated to anti-Masonry, to the long and ignoble tradition of anti-Masonic paranoia that really begins, and the thread of continuity through that long history is the Catholic Church. Although other religions have been similarly afraid of Freemasonry. It begins with the excommunication in 1738, if I'm remembering my dates correctly. But it really takes off after the French Revolution, when it becomes wedded to conspiracy theories. You know, the original, a modern conspiracy in the sense that we see it today of, you know, there's a secret elite behind the scenes controlling world affairs, you know, wake up sheeple. That's that modern conspiracy was the template for that is the Freemasons. In the paranoid vision of a former Jesuit priest called the Abbé Barruel, who wrote his book In Exile in London, and he did it to explain the French Revolution. The French Revolution was so cataclysmic an upheaval from his point of view that it had to be the result of a dastardly plot, and the dastardly plot was the Masons. And that idea in its own way proved as contagious as the idea of Masonic fellowship, of the structures and rituals and so on of Freemasonry, that span far beyond what Freemasons themselves could ever control. And it became the official ideology of the Catholic Church, the idea that the Masons were inspired by the devil and were controlling world affairs from behind the scenes. And it then became built into the ideologies of both the extreme left and the extreme right in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I trace that tradition, looking particularly in the book at the way that fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and particularly Franco's Spain repressed Freemasonry. And tracing some of that story still even today in, you know, the many countries where Freemasonry is banned, notably Islamic countries, all but two of them. So that story is, you know, the conspiracy theory is part of the way the Freemasons have made the modern world.
Oh, thank you, John. Thank you so much. Back to the chat screen. Leslie's been in touch and he says, I found your book very entertaining and interesting, with a lot of themes going along that line today. How long did it take you to research and write, and how did you obtain some of the information? Because we know that you've spoken to a lot of Freemasons in order to do this as well. Answer Leslie's question.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, really from start to finish, it was about 5 years. Although, as I said, I had something of a head start on some of the issues I covered, notably in relation to Italy. I really wanted a lot, you know, substantial parts of the book. I think there are 2 or 3 chapters in Italy, because Italy's a pioneer in so many things in Freemasonry, pioneers anti-Masonry, pioneers the use of Freemasonry as a model for revolutionary politics in the early 19th century. Fascist Italy is the first country to ban Freemasonry, and fascist Italy is where Freemasonry gives birth to various bastard offspring like the Sicilian Mafia, and where even today there is substantial evidence of links between forms of Freemasonry and organized crime. So I had a head start there, but it still took a hell of a lot of legwork, and I've actually never enjoyed researching a book as much, you know, you know, and I've written a history of Italian food, so that gives you some idea of the fun I had doing it.
The good thing is, though, John, it's palpable when you talk about the research and your book. It really is. I think that's coming over beautifully. So let's talk about Freemasonry's reputation. How has it changed over the years? Because there's a lot of work at the moment being done, especially with the UJ elite, to normalize Freemasonry. How do you think it's changed over the years? Do you think it's going in the right direction?
It depends where you're talking about. You know, my book is a global book, and you can see huge ups and downs in the reputation of Freemasonry over the years. You know, in the United States, for example, when it was endorsed by George Washington as president, when he really adopted in a republic that by definition could not have a religion of state, he adopted Freemasonry as the nearest thing that America, the United States, of the new United States of America, could have a religion of state. And as a result, Freemasonry enjoyed enormous prestige in the United States. Then came the Morgan affair and the Morgan crisis, and its prestige absolutely plummeted. And then in the post-Civil War era, again, it just grew and grew and grew and became this really part of the fabric of American life in a way that it hasn't done anywhere else, whilst the whole time being completely fissured on racial lines and being a sort of almost proclamation of the profound divisions that American society has on racial lines. Because of course in the United States for a long, long time, the picture is shifting now, but basically there were black Freemasons and white Freemasons, and never the twain shall meet. And in Britain, ditto. You know, we've seen a crisis in Freemasonry's reputation really since the 1980s, I think, to do with a series of scandals, largely propelled by a series of scandals associated with the police. When it became, you know, anti-Masonry has been appropriated by one political side and the other at various times, and that's when the left got hold of it in the UK, in the interests, perfectly understandable interests to some extent, of transparency. And then in Italy, places like Italy, where, you know, Freemasonry enjoyed enormous prestige in the second half of the 19th century. The newly unified Italy was very, very Masonic. You know, Garibaldi was a Freemason, and Freemason was really important to the sort of ideological fabric of Italy after it was unified. And then you contrast that with today, where I can't think of a country in the Western world where Freemasonry's reputation is lower than in Italy. You know, most Italians will assume that Freemasonry is the mafia, basically a sort of second order mafia. And that's various factors to do with that, but it's largely propelled by the P2 affair, which has some sobering lessons for Freemasons, I think.
Back to the chat screen, John, if we may.
Yeah.
Brethren, ladies and gentlemen, we're not going to get through all of these. I guarantee you that's the case. But
it's nice to see there's so many questions.
There's literally hundreds of them, isn't there? Which is a massive compliment to you, isn't it? David Canning's been in touch, and he says, what surprised you the most when writing or researching the book? So was there anything that came along and made you go, wow, okay, wasn't expecting that?
Well, gosh. I mean, lots of things, you know. I found the Taxil affair quite bizarre and extraordinary. I don't know if you know this extraordinary hoax perpetuated on the Catholic Church by a guy pretending to be a devil-worshipping Freemason who was coming out and revealing the secrets. That was amazing. One of the wonderful things that I found about writing the history of Freemasonry, I really enjoyed exploring the links between Freemasonry and the British Empire. And in my sort of Kipling chapter, and I really enjoyed the way that Freemasonry provides a wonderful kind of keyhole on all kinds of different moments in history, that it takes you to some extraordinary places as a historical theme, whether it be anti-Masonry and this paranoia that I've talked about, or whether it's just following the strange evolutions and journeys of this contagious organizational model, if you like, that I've talked about. I mean, just for example, I loved researching American history through the lens of Freemasonry, looking at the Civil War and the way that Freemasons, if you like, were involved on both sides of the Civil War and Reconstruction, black and white Freemasonry. I thought that was a really fascinating moment in history. The chapter I centre on Charleston, which some of you may well know for a long time was the sort of capital of the Scottish Rite, but also one of the capitals of slavery.
Now, I've asked you what really pricked up your ears when you were researching the book. It must have been frustrating because your book takes us all over the world, doesn't it? Scotland, England, France, Italy, America, then back again. Was there anything you were absolutely gutted to leave out of the book? Because that's the curse of the author, isn't it? You've got to decide. We can't put this in.
I mean, I had all these plans. I've got a friend I used to play football with, who's a Ghanaian Freemason, and he was all ready to welcome me to Ghana because I wanted to go to you know, in the final chapter, it's a bit of a quick tour of the world. How are we doing now, following some of the themes and the stories that I've covered. And I wanted to go to a country where Freemasonry is growing and prospering, and, you know, where maybe I hadn't been in the rest of the book. And Ghana seemed like the perfect opportunity, but I just ran out of time to go to Ghana. So that's the one I really missed out on. But more generally, you know, both writing the book and since publishing it, it's been fascinating and fantastic just to sit down and talk to loads of different Freemasons. You know, I've talked to India and the United States, right across Europe, from the mafia badlands of Calabria to, you know, different parts of the UK. You know, one of the first Masons I talked to was a guy who's a member of a lodge in Rothley in Leicestershire, which is near where I grew up. Member of a lodge that was formed around the golf club where I used to be a junior member when I was a kid. So it took me right back to my roots, but also, you know, miles and miles away, to an artist who was a former Freemason, whose work I've included, who's Australian, whose work I've included in the book. In some ways, it represents the sort of final concluding moment, concluding metaphor of the whole book. So it's been an amazing trip. And it seems to be continuing. It seems to be continuing. In the spring, I'm going to Belgium to address a sort of plenary assembly of Belgian Freemasons and talk to them about the future of Freemasonry. So wish me luck.
Actually, on that topic, future of Freemasonry, how do you see it in the next 10 to 20 years? The reason I asked that, it was on my list of things to ask you anyway, but Svi Preschel, and I do apologise, ladies and gentlemen, brethren, if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but Svi wants to know, how do you see Freemasonry in 10 to 20 years ahead of where we are now?
Again, it depends where you go.
Yeah.
It depends, you know, what part of the world we're talking about. I think I'd like to think that the issue of secrecy is going to be revisited, and not just to sort of represent what's already there. I think I sense that that's outlived its purpose, and I'd like to think Freemasons need to be a bit more honest about that. My own view is, again, I'd like to see Freemasonry revisit its policy on gender. You know, yes, I know there are women in English Freemasonry, but I think the norm should be mixité, as they call it in the Grand Orient in French, mixed lodges. And I think also that Freemasonry has to confront, you know, for a long time it was a man's organization. It was about making men, shaping masculinity, and it's got to confront that history to move forward, I feel. I mean, I know very well that older Freemasons, you know, one of the reasons they join is precisely because it's, you know, there will be among men. and maybe that places can be created for that kind of thing. But I think that needs to change. Really, the thing that I'm best placed to give advice about is not the future of Freemasonry, because there's no reason why you should listen to me about that. But it's about the past of Freemasonry. I'm a Freemason. I'm a historian, and one of my goals in this book is to get Freemasons to look at their history differently, to tell different stories, to tell stories about their past, true stories that are not so celebratory, that are not just about giving themselves a pat on the back for how they've made it so far and done this and that. You know, Freemasonry has to confront its role in empire and, you know, some of the atrocities and appalling things that went on under the British Empire. And I try to deal with that in the Kipling chapter and show that the role Freemasonry played both generally, but also in that specific case around the Boer War and around the First World War and so on and so forth. And, you know, like the National Trust and like universities like mine, you know, we need to take a look at our collective past, I think.
And when you did your research, John, and I know you had, going back to that, a perception of Freemasonry way before researching and over the last 5 years putting it together, what really impressed you about Freemasonry? What really wowed you? Some of the things that Freemasonry as a whole do well?
Well, you know what? I mean, you know, like many people who you sort of grew up in the 70s, 80s, I had more or less ingested the idea that sedimented into public opinion in that idea that Freemasons are a sort of grubby cabal who are about policemen scratching each other's backs and, you know, that kind of thing. Jobs for the boys. And very soon, you know, found out that there was a much richer story. And in fact, that's the reason I fell in love with the idea of doing this book, is there is, God, once you get past that, you realize there's a world of stories out there that need telling. But, you know, one of the fascinating things about this book, and one of the things I had to kind of keep here while I was writing it, is that every time I've sat down with a Freemason from anywhere in the world, it hasn't taken long. You know, when I ask the simple question, what does Freemasonry mean to you, for the sort of eyes to moisten and the bottom lip to wobble a bit, or, you know, that sense, the sense that bit of what it's done for people, that sense of belonging it gives, that sense of purpose, that ability to turn out towards the outside world, and, you know, with it from within sure foundations, all of that sort of thing, I think, is incredibly impressive. And you have to, you know, as a non-Mason, you have to take account of that. If you're writing the history of Freemasonry and you can't see that, or you just laugh it off, or you scoff at it, then you're not getting the poignancy and the power of the issues that are, you know, less flattering, shall we say, to Freemasonry in history, whether it be the P2 episode in Italy, or you know, the role of Freemasonry in the British Empire, or, you know, the race divide in American history. The reason why those issues count and have a real emotion in the story, you know, I wanted to try and get across in the storytelling, is precisely because of that emotional power of belonging that Freemasonry gives to people.
That's lovely to hear, John. Thank you. And final word, I'm going to ask you about your book in just a second and how we can get hold of it. But final word from Bob Cunningham, and it kind of ties on lovely to what we've just spoke about. He says, you mentioned your grandfather joined through the need to keep the camaraderie he had in the forces. Do you think that link bond with ex-forces is still there and is still going?
It seems to be, as far as I can tell. I mean, I know there are a lot of, ex-military lodges or, ex-forces people in Freemasonry. I don't know of any statistics that would, allow us to judge whether that's, representative either of Freemasonry or of ex-forces people, what the proportions are. But it's a theme that runs right through Masonic history. Soldiers have, carried their aprons and their gloves in their knapsacks all around the world. It's no coincidence that in regimental lodges and so on and so forth, it's no coincidence that Freemasonry spread around the world in the 18th century, because the 18th century was the first era of global war, from the Americas to, whatever. That link is a very powerful theme in my book. I mean, it comes out again and again, and again in the Kipling chapter, as that I mentioned earlier.
John, we've run out of time, sadly, but I've got a few questions to ask you about your book. First of all, when's it been turned into a series?
I'd love to think so. I mean, I don't know. There are TV, I've made TV programs before, mostly in Italy, although you can see my history of Italian food on Amazon at the moment. It's called Eating History Dickie into Amazon. You can pull it up for free if you've got a Prime subscription. So I've made some TV before. And I've had those conversations, but it's just with Netflix, the days when the BBC made documentaries with historians wandering around in front of castles are now gone. Netflix has all the money, Amazon has all the money, and they have a certain house style, and it's very, very difficult, even more difficult than ever, for academics to get access to the airwaves. More's the pity. I'd love to see it done. I'd really, really love to see it done. And I've had, all the way through the book, I've had chats with producers and people. So, but you just have to wait for the plums to come up on the fruit machine. I'm afraid there's not much else I can do.
Let's keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people have mentioned that about your book being turned into a series. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? And brethren, ladies and gentlemen, if we've left you wanting more this evening, that's kind of the point, really. So we've got two things there. You can go and get John's book, or maybe we invite John back for another Solomon Live. John, how can we get your book?
Well, you can get on all good bookshops on Amazon, but you can also get it autographed copies from the bookshop in Freemasons Hall. So if you get hold of them, I've got a sore wrist autographing tons of copies for them in the bookshop there. So pick up the phone and talk to the bookshop, or in Freemasons Hall, or go online. I'm sure they can sort you out.
John, have you enjoyed your experience on Solomon Live?
I've enjoyed it immensely. It's really nice not having to present the book for spend half an hour, because normally I'm pretty deoxygenated by the time I'm finished presenting the book, and I don't, the chat always passes me by. So it's really nice to engage in this kind of debate. Now I'm looking forward to doing more. As I said, I've got debates scheduled in different parts of Europe. I'm doing various provincial level events, which are being set up. So yeah, have book will travel.
Excellent. Well, I've absolutely loved hosting Solomon Live tonight. I had a million more questions to answer you. Well, maybe not a million, but a few more to ask you. And we would have been here till midnight. But John, thank you for joining us on Solomon Live. You've been absolutely brilliant. Our next Solomon Live will be, ladies and gentlemen and brethren, a day in the life of the Program Master, Peter Lowndes. Same time, 7:30. Please put the date in your diary, but we'll keep you informed. Tuesday, the 28th of September. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you register to Solomon Live. It is absolutely fantastic. solomon.ugle.org.uk is where you need to go, full of papers and videos, all to help you with your daily advancement in Masonic knowledge. Thank you for joining us this evening, and we'll see you very soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Brody. Bye.